Friends, already this morning, some of the terminology associated with our diocesan strategy has come up, and you'll hear these words again through the rest of the day, I've no doubt. Focal ministers, oversight ministers, lights for Christ. But my prayer for today has been that the gathering will lift our sights above the pandemic, definitely above the financial challenges faced within the Diocese of Sheffield, above the party politics of the Church of England, way beyond our diocesan strategy, to a vision of what the Church has always been intended by God to be within his purpose for all of creation. And to some extent, I'm now anticipating here the keynote address we'll receive shortly from Bishop Graham Tomlin, the Bishop of Kensington, because that's the brief I gave him, both to lift our sights and also to focus on the purpose entrusted to the Church within the providence of God for all creation in the work of regeneration, recreation that God is about. Here's a quotation that some of you will have heard me use before. Indeed, some of you will have heard me use it so often that you will almost have memorized it yourself. These are the words of the late, great Leslie Newbigin, ordained into the Presbyterian Church of Scotland in 1936, and then in the 1950s, Bishop of Madras in the Church of South India, that extraordinary structural unification of the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, and the Methodists. He died in 1998, and he once wrote this: "The Church and every local congregation of the Church is intended by God to be a first fruit, a sign and an instrument of God's new creation." Every word in that definition is important. This is still a quotation. The Church is the place where there really is fellowship with God through Jesus Christ here and now as a first fruit of the much fuller and greater reality which God intends. Therefore, the Church really is a sign pointing beyond itself by its fellowship and its works of love to the coming of God's kingdom. And it really is an instrument working to establish that kingdom. It can be the means through which God's will is done in the world and his reign becomes effective. Therefore, the key question which has to be asked of the Church and of every local congregation of the Church is not how rich is it, how big is it, or even how fast is it growing. It is, what difference is it making in that part of the world in which it is placed? Is it actually functioning as a first fruit, a sign and an instrument of God's new creation in that part of God's world? It's a fabulous quotation, and if it is by any chance the first time you've heard me use it, you can be fairly sure it won't be the last.
Well, hello, wherever you're watching this or however you're watching this, it is great to be with you and to share just in this little slightly strange way online, as we've got used to doing in your day of re-envisioning and study for the Diocese of Sheffield. It's been great to know Bishop Pete for many years and to support him and all of you in the ministry that you have, the calling you have to be the Church of Jesus Christ in your part of the country. I guess a lot of the time in church life, we get ourselves consumed by all the busyness of church life, all the PCCs and synods and the fabric and the budgets and the rotas and the services and everything else that we have to do in church all the time. But I want for a few minutes today just to step back from that a little bit and ask the question, what is the church for? Why do we do it? Why do we get up in the morning and go to church on a Sunday? Why do we pour ourselves into the life of the church in the way that we do? But I think in order to answer that question, what is the church for, we need to ask a prior question. And that question is, what is the world for? Why was this world created? Because unless we get an answer to that question, we can't really understand what the church is for. Now, you could come up with all kinds of answers to the question of why did God create the world? It's almost an impossible question to answer. We can't see entirely into the mind of God to know exactly what went on, and when, if you like, that divine decision was taken to create a world. But I think if there's one answer I would give, and particularly that comes from the book of Psalms, because of course the doctrine of creation in the Bible is not just there in Genesis, it's there in other texts such as the book of Isaiah, the book of Psalms as well. If there's one answer that I think I would give is, why was the world created? It was created for joy. It was created to bring joy to God, but also to bring joy to us and the rest of creation as well. You find texts like Psalm 104 where it says this: "May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works." God seems to have created the world so that he might rejoice in it, so that he might look upon it, as it says in the book of Genesis, and see that it was good. The world was created for the joy of God, that he might enjoy his creation. But it's not just a sort of selfish act by God to create something that he might enjoy, but he creates a world so that it might find joy in itself and in its relationship with God. And so in Psalm 96, we read these words: "Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth." And you get that note quite often in the Psalms, that idea of creation rejoicing before the Lord, the fields, the mountains, the trees, all rejoicing in God. So the world was created to bring joy. It exists to give God joy and to give us joy. That's the way it was meant to work. But this is what I want to focus on today. It's true of the church itself, because that reading from Peter said this: that the church is a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a people chosen out of the rest of the human race in order to bless the rest of the human race. You see the pattern? You see humanity chosen out of all the species of the world to bless the rest of the world. Priests chosen out of the church to bless the rest of the church. But if you like, in the middle of those, the church called out of the whole of the human race to bring God's blessing to the rest of the human race. And that is our calling as the church. It is to be a blessing to the world, to the communities that we live in, the particular places, parishes we call them, into which God has placed us. Now, how do we do that? How does the church bring the blessing of God to its community and the world in which we're placed, and particularly to the human race, the human community and societies in which we are located? Well, again, go back to one of the phrases in that text. It says this: that the church is a chosen people, a royal priesthood, called to declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. In other words, the primary task of the church is to declare the praises of God. Now, you might ask the question, who do we declare the praises of God to? And again, I think there are two answers to that question. The first is that we declare the praises of God to God. It's the primary calling of the church, to worship, to rejoice, to declare the praises of God to God. That's the first calling of the church, to be joyful, to joyfully proclaim back to God his goodness and the goodness of the world that he's created. That is our calling. It is to worship. Now, it's not because God needs that, Of course, God doesn't need to be reminded how good he is. It's because we need it. We need it and the rest of the world needs it. We, on behalf of the whole of the rest of the world, until they catch up one day, are called to worship and declare the praises of God to God. Because we need to be reminded again and again of how good God is, what a good world this is. We need to be reminded of how far we have fallen short of his calling and how much we need forgiveness. And yet we're also called to remember again and again the goodness of his salvation for us. And so the first calling of the church is to rejoice. It's to express our joy at living in such a beautiful world, to express our sorrow at the damage we have done, to give thanks for the rescue, the forgiveness, the grace that we've been given in Jesus Christ. Our first calling as the church is to gaze into the face of Jesus Christ and the God that is revealed through him. Now, we all do that in different ways, different parts of the church, worship in different styles. The style, if you like, is secondary. It's the calling that is primary. Our first calling is to declare the praises of God to God in worship. And if I can just add one note at this point, if you think of that is our primary calling as the church, to worship God and to bring joy to God by that very action. It says something, I think, about our perpetual anxiety in the church about survival. One of the things we often worry about in the church is we think of the decline of the church in recent times. And we think is the church going to survive into the next generation? We're worried about cuts of money and clergy posts and everything else. Very often you hear in the church the cry, the church won't be here in 20 years' time if we do nothing. But it seems to me that's not a good reason for action in the church. Because if we spend all our time focusing and worrying about survival, if that's our focus, then we're focusing on survival, we're not focusing upon Christ. And the calling of the church is not to worry about its own survival, it's to gaze into the face of Jesus Christ, to be caught up in worship of God. A church that focuses on survival is doomed. Paradoxically, the more concerned we are with survival, the more likely we are to die. Because if we're focused on survival, we're turned in upon ourselves, we worry about our own institution. And that idea of turning in upon ourselves is, of course, Martin Luther's great definition of sin, the heart curved in upon itself. There's a book by a theologian called Michael Jenkins called The Church Faces Death. And he says this in that book, is the church is most attractive when it pursues its own vocation, unconcerned with its own survival. The church will thrive to the degree to which it is fascinated and caught up in the worship of Jesus Christ. Because the more we're caught up in the worship of Jesus Christ, as we'll talk about in a moment, the more we begin to share that news. If we're focused on survival, it's anxious, it's narrowing, it doesn't really help us in any great way. So we are to focus on God, not survival. And we do that by doing what we do best, and what is our first calling as the church, to worship. But there's a second calling of the church, the second way in which the church enacts this call to be a blessing to the world, to be this royal priesthood of the world. And that is by declaring the praises of God, not just to God, but to the world. And so if you like, if the first calling of the church is worship, the second calling of the church is witness.